it's the deadliest year in decades for people detained by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that's according to a new report from NPR. At least 20 people have died in ICE custody so far this year, and that's the highest toll since 2004, according to another review by NPR. The grim milestone comes as the Trump administration ramps up its chaotic and cruel mass deportation campaign. According to government data obtained and released by the nonpartisan research organization TRAC, about 60,000 people are now in ICE custody. That is a record number. They're packed into detention facilities where, as NPR notes, reports across the country from immigrant advocates and media organizations all point to overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, limited access to medical care, and lack of oversight. A Senate investigation this summer uncovered over 500 credible reports of human rights abuses in detention facilities since President Trump returned to office. And a separate ProPublica report found more than 170 U.S. citizens have been unlawfully detained by immigration officers, some of them beaten while in custody. The escalating abuses come as the Supreme Court has gutted nearly every safeguard that once held ICE accountable. In September, the 6 conservative justices sided with ICE in a case called Noem versus Vasquez-Padermo. The ruling blocked lower court limits on racial profiling and made it nearly impossible for victims to win injunctions against future abuse. Justice Brett Kavanaugh even argued that targeting someone solely based on their apparent ethnicity could be considered relevant to law enforcement, effectively giving agents permission to racially profile for what immigration lawyers now call Kavanaugh stops. As my next guest, Ian Millhiser, puts it, there were once 5 ways to constrain rogue federal officers. The Supreme Court, he says, has effectively nuked 3 of them, cutting off, quote, the most effective ways of ensuring that federal law enforcement officers comply with the law. Ian Millhiser now joins us. He is a senior correspondent at Vox and author of The Agenda, How a Republican Supreme Court is Reshaping America. And also with us is Alan Orr, an immigration attorney. Ian, Alan, thanks for being here. I want to start with you, Ian. Do you think that all of this as specific to immigration enforcement, or are you seeing something deeper as far as this apparatus? Like, how far is the machinery of government moving outside the bounds of the law and accountability?
Yeah, I mean, it's very deep. I mean, bear in mind, we're talking about the same Supreme Court, which said that Donald Trump is allowed to use the powers of the presidency to commit crimes. So this is, I mean, immigration is where we're seeing the biggest effects, but this is a widespread problem with the Supreme Court. It has wanted to immunize law enforcement officers from many forms of accountability, especially federal law enforcement officers from many forms of accountability. It used to be, for example, that if a federal law enforcement officer abused you, violated your constitutional right, you could sue the officer and collect money from the officer. So that was an effective way of deterring bad behavior by federal law enforcement. The court has basically cut that off in the last 5 years. They've made it very hard to get injunctions, which is a court order preventing a federal agency from doing something illegal. And so, yeah, this is a pretty systemic problem where the Supreme Court seems to be very tolerant of lawlessness, at least from certain administrations.
Alan, usually when people have these sorts of troubles, they go to the law, they go to lawyers. But with the Supreme Court taking away so many of the safeguards, how has that changed your engagement of the justice system, your ability to advocate on behalf of your clients? And what does that mean in terms of holding the system accountable when these efforts have been made to strip notions of accountability away, as Ian has already talked about?
Sure. So first, I think we need to start with the history lesson, because this isn't new to us. After 9/11, we had the same sort of things happen under the PATRIOT Act. And what we did then was we sued and we recorded the violations. And that's most important right now. You're seeing across the country, the recorded violations sort of building a case and then bringing those actions. While Bivens has been lessened, which is the case he talked about earlier, there's still the Federal Tort Claims Act. And a lot of people are filing those claims and sort of bringing them forward. There has to be a legislative fix, just like there was with the PATRIOT Act, but it took some time and overall violations to sort of move this forward. So lawyers continue to have to be lawyers and understand that this is not going to be fixed in 1 or 2 or 3 years. We have to build the case and show the court why ICE isn't working effectively. More importantly, we also have to note that ICE has hired a lot of officers recently, and those Bivens decisions were based on those officers knowing the constitutional rights to enforce the law. And these new officers don't know that, so it may weaken those courts with the right evidence in court.
Building a case, knowing history, enforcing the law, constitutional protections, all very important. There's a history here that is concerning to me individually as a civil rights attorney, Ian. When you're talking about Brett Kavanaugh essentially giving license around racial profiling for immigration, does it stop there? And what are the bigger implications on the Supreme Court's commentary about race in this moment and what it can mean for Americans and law enforcement going forward?
I think one of the big themes of this Supreme Court's just approach to the Trump administration and approach to this government is that they don't want to stop problems before they happen. You know, the biggest example we're seeing this is they're cutting off the Voting Rights Act, which was a law that was designed to stop disenfranchisement before it happens, not allow you to file a lawsuit 4 years later after you've already lost your right to vote. So if you look at things like the Federal Tort Claims Act, which is now an avenue that's available, the good news with the Federal Tort Claims Act is that you can get money from the U.S. Treasury if a federal law enforcement officer abuses you. The bad news is I don't think either Donald Trump or any individual law enforcement officer is going to care if the taxpayers have to pay someone down the road. You know, what you need is you need consequences against Trump. You need consequences against Trump administration officials. You need consequences against the individual officers who violate the law. And that is what the Supreme Court has been cutting off. It's been cutting off the things that deter people from breaking the law before it actually happens.
Ian, let's stay on the Supreme Court for a moment because you just were talking about them. To see a court sort of move in such lockstep with an administration for the executive branch, is there a viable or plausible argument that they are blurring the lines in a way that is delegitimizing the independence of the judiciary and threatening its own credibility here?
Yeah. I think we've certainly seen the court transform into a partisan institution. And, and it's not surprising if you think of the recent history of judicial nominations. Remember when Merrick Garland was supposed to be a Supreme Court justice and then Republicans in the Senate blocked him because Garland is not a Republican and they wanted Neil Gorsuch, who is a Republican, to be in that seat. Remember when Justice Ginsburg died and they raced to confirm Amy Coney Barrett before the election could happen, because again, they wanted a Republican in that seat. So, the confirmations process has become so partisan. And what do you know when you turn the process of picking justices into a purely partisan process, the court itself becomes a partisan institution. And now we see a court that is very favorable to Republican administrations, while, they were very aggressive in striking down Biden administration programs when a Democrat was in the White House.
Alan, can you talk for a minute briefly about how these rulings are impacting the lives of immigrants and immigrant communities? How, if any way, are they changing behaviors and how people sort of move through society each and every day?
Hughes, of course. I mean, the statement is they're no longer free to move around the cabin. They're losing their rights and pushing themselves back. They're becoming less human. We're building a second-class society where people don't have access to the fundamental rights protected under the Constitution. And while the court isn't perfect, it is the court we have, and we need to deal with resolutions to find the solutions we need for our clients. And part of that is building up the case. And I hope that taxpayers paying out against the Tort Claims Act will sort of push that forward by saying we're not going to waste our dollars on this anymore. Just the same thing happened under the Patriot Act.
Such an important conversation, and getting that to happen is going to require people getting the information. Ian, Alan, you have both helped educate us in a very important way this morning, and thanks to you both.